not just something that are felt by, people working from a critical advocacy perspective, right? And there is a sense, clearly on the part of some states at least, of the way in which human rights and SDG processes complement each other. And linked to this, there's also an inadequately critical understanding on the part of the review authors as to how SDG processes may crowd out child rights or not give effect. But they're there, right? There is a willingness to engage. Much to my irritation, as I really felt that was going to be kind of a slam dunk page, so it's actually going to involve quite a bit of work. Girls' rights comes up a bit. The other thing is, of course, that it's not, child rights isn't just about, you can't just look at the adult-driven processes that lead to SDG, around review of SDG implementation progress. There's also a requirement that children will be involved in those processes, whether at the national level, but also at the HLPF level, right? So you have this situation, and at the moment I'm struggling to find information, but I'm hoping to find more, that the way in which that child participation is very much mediated at the moment is through the functioning of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, which is, there's a series of major groups that provide input from particular groups, particular social groups, right, so women, etc. And it's very interesting because on the one hand, yes, you certainly see they have a Twitter account, they for sure speak at events, they participate in side events of the HLPF, but it certainly isn't the kind of ground-up child rights participatory model that those of us who work in child rights would like to see or expect to see, and it is clearly skewed towards older children. Which is interesting because, what does that say to you about the goals that are concerned with, child survival that are aimed frequently at much younger children? Okay, so there's clear gaps there. The other thing is we have a group of friends in the group of friends of children and the SDGs, right? And this is a group of states who appoint themselves, as a member, who doesn't love children. There's 60 of them at the moment, I think. And they make little statements. And they use careless rights language. Sometimes, they don't always use rights language. Sometimes they just talk about children, how great they are, and how good the SDGs will be for them, right? I mean, I'm being slightly caustic, but actually I'm not being utterly completely unfair here. And that's a big issue. The other thing that I need to flag as well is I've just said that I was a bit disappointed is the wrong word, intrigued to see the references to human rights that I have done. But you'll also be interested at the states that make reference to human rights. So for instance, Bahrain, big focus on human rights. It isn't just the fuzzy-wuzzy Scandies, it's here's language. We are totally on that human rights language. So it isn't going to be about number of mentions, it's going to be how human rights language is used and why. And ditto child rights. And of course, children are, a subsection, child rights is a subsection of human rights, and I think inevitably going to have to draw conclusions from references to human rights rather than child rights because there simply aren't enough. Okay, so that is methodologically unsatisfying, but I think I need to acknowledge that I'll be doing that anyway. Right. Finally, I am going to look at the role of different actors in the implementation processes with implications for child rights. Okay, that's all implementation processes. I'm not really sure why I have with implications for child rights because there really aren't many SDG related processes that don't have a child rights or a child rights impact, whether directly or indirectly. Okay, so crucially, I've already raised this issue of the fact that the SDGs are certainly non-state actor friendly. You have this extensive reference to the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. It uses business and IFIs, and indeed it's interesting that the one time the Convention on the Rights of the Child is mentioned, I was like, yes! And then I looked, and it's in the context of the contribution that business can make to the realisation of the SDGs as part of the partnership. And I think that's interesting because it means you go, gosh, well, if they're comfortable with it, is it that we've seen a huge shift, or is it in fact that the impact is considered to be so minimal that they can, for instance, be happy enough with that reference? Because you can bet that wouldn't have been in there if there was massive resistance from the business sector. Well, perhaps I'm overly cynical, but I would assume so. The other thing is that, I mean, I would argue that this creates a real risk of corporate capture of SDGs. And I think that there is and this is a problem that is exacerbated by the fact that there's, as I said, there's very little human rights capture of non-state actors, right? But there is a real risk of corporate capture. It's really interesting to see the way in which businesses talk about SDGs, and particularly how certain states are basically using it as, you know, as a way of talk about how, you know, the SDGs is sort of one of the key things that they talk about with SDGs is how it's a great opportunity for states to work together with the private sector. And this will be very familiar to those of you who do stuff around business and human rights, and the risks of that will be familiar to you too. There's also, and I mean, I would love to say that it's just, you know, the states, or it's just business, you know, the classic bad people, bad guys of, when it comes to human rights. But in fact, one of the things that's really quite worrying is the way in which we see a tendency by child rights actors, so advocates, OHCHR, Unicef, to promote the synergies of the SDGs and human rights without actually acknowledging real problems in terms of SDG content or implementation mechanisms from the perspective of child rights. Okay? And for instance, I think on the slide I cite particularly a UNICEF. UNICEF has done some really interesting work, and UNICEF is problematic because while they have a child-related mandate, they're not a child rights organisation, and the language they use around rights is frequently wishy-washy and not related to the language of the CRC, right? You know, the child's right to live a full life, the child's right to well-being, which you can argue full and good can be implied, but they kind of present it as if it's, you know, or the rewriting of provisions, you know, a right to a healthy life, which they would argue is, you know, the health right under Article 24, and it's not. So what you see is you see a tendency towards rather careless use of language by those working in the development sector from a child perspective already, and that has been really exacerbated. And one of the things that you see that's really worrying is, for instance, you saw, and I mean, I'm overly harsh on UNICEF, but it's a hugely important entity. And if you look at, say, UNICEF and the way in which that they talk about the SDGs, but also if you even look at their mapping document, I think it's from 2016, where they map the SDGs in terms of child rights, they don't talk about where there's gaps or where there's omissions or where there's missing. And, you know, on the one hand, you're like, it's great, you know, what they're trying to do is to suggest that child rights isn't scary and the SDGs are good, but actually what they are in effect doing is saying, do your SDGs and you've done child rights. Okay, so by trying to bring people on board by suggesting rights aren't scary, they are also, to some degree, diluting the power of rights and undermining rights. And the other thing is that if we say, look at, you see it more broadly as well, there's a report by the UN Secretary General, I give you the link there, and it's, you know, you look at it and it's all about the synergies between economic and social rights and human rights, and SDGs. But as you know, has been argued very effectively, you know, if you're I mean, Philip Alston raised this in I'm going to get the year wrong now, I think it's a 2016 report, and he said, well, you know, if you see this elision of a development approach and an economic and social rights approach, and you treat them as being identical, that's an elision that is almost inevitably going to be at the expense of economic and social rights. Okay? And part of that is because we've been here before. We've seen economic and social rights subordinated to development discourse. Very positively though, right, so I'm being negative, but one of the very positive aspects is the CRC, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which has been quite careful. When the Committee on the Rights of the Child asks questions of states, when it's monitoring state reports, it makes reference, for instance, under the right to an adequate standard of living, it makes references to it makes references to the need to under the SDGs the goal of the target of developing national social protection systems, and they talk about the goal of reducing child poverty. Right? They don't do it in such a way as to say, if you meet this, you have no problems in terms of your convention obligations, but what they're doing is that they are acknowledging that this is a process done properly, the SDG implementation process, that may contribute to satisfy the child's right to an adequate standard of living. So that's a fairly thoughtful, critical, I would say quite clever engagement, right? And it's certainly more thoughtful and critical than you see from actors who simply treat the SDGs and child rights as indistinguishable. Right, I'm not looking, and this is one of the areas I'm going to finish in the next 3 minutes, where I would value your input. I am not going to be looking at the issue of data and human rights. There are tons of incredibly skilled data experts out there. I am not one of them, right? And you see, there is actually, ironically, if anyone is a data expert, a big gap on the child rights point. But I am not a data expert, and that is not what I am doing. But I wonder, can I be critical of, can I in fact do a thorough criticism of the international implementation process without looking at data? So that's a question. And the other thing I am not going to do is talk about how child rights should be reconceptualized in the context of sustainable development. Right, so there's a new book out by Fenton, edited by Claire Fenton Glynn. Really, I've only been able to read bits of it because it's just out in Google Books, Mrs. Pages. But clearly this is a big theme, and it makes sense, right? CRC, 1989, hopelessly outdated in some ways, doesn't talk about the environment, doesn't talk about climate change, doesn't talk about girl children, doesn't engage properly with social models of disability, so many things, right? But that isn't what I'm doing, not because I think it's perfect, but because I think that actually my problem with how the SDGs and child rights relationship is working out is not because the CRC is at fault, it is to do with the way in which the SDGs are dealing with the CRC as it stands. But again, maybe that's incredibly uncritical, and maybe I'm just showing my bias as a lawyer. So, challenge of solutions. I've tried to think about how I might, how can we tackle this? How can we tackle the conceptual issue? When we're talking about turning child rights talk into child rights compliant practice, compliant practice. So first of all, there's a recent statement by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It talks about rights as underpinning rather than identical to SDGs, so that's clearly consistent with the approach of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And they flag how rights can be a framework that should serve as a bedrock or an assessment measure for SDG implementation, right? And I've already spoken to you earlier on about how I feel child rights could do that. Okay, so there is stuff out there that this work will contribute to. What else do I think needs to happen? And of course, this is all up for grabs because my views may change. I think there's a real need to move towards the adoption of a critical child rights-based approach to development. At the moment, human rights impact assessments, whether post facto or ex ante, are really hot, right? Everyone loves a good human rights impact assessment, and child rights impact assessment has been there for longer, right? It's really well entrenched. But actually, child rights impact assessment, even if it's ex ante before the event, is not going to get you there in terms of really having a child rights compliant or child rights sensitive development process or outcome. So I think we need to move on that. And we have to be critical, and that means critical. It means not just saying, oh great, they're talking about child rights, this is so exciting. It's about really engaging with the development practitioners to try to develop practice around child rights. Child rights. I can talk about it in the middle. And finally, I think that there is, and this is a problem, I think potentially with the paper, is that ultimately, when you talk about the high level, the global implementation, it is to some degree a paper review. Okay, states present, then there's a sense of this synthesis, sure, civil society inputs, but it's not an in-depth analysis of implementation of SDGs in practice. It's what states say is happening to a large extent in the HLPF. I mean, I'm possibly a bit too dismissive, but what I am wondering is, do I need, in fact, to focus on specific national efforts to implement SDGs and the extent to which a child rights-based approach is employed in those efforts? First of all, because actually it's probably easier at a national level to have a meaningful child rights-based approach, like a proper participatory model. So it's interesting. In Ireland, we see the state is working to develop a child participation model with regards to the SDGs, right? So involving child participation has been a big part of the government agenda, and you can see it happening in the SDGs, right? And then, you know, if we look in Scotland, we see a situation in which both, if we look at Scotland, we see a situation in which we have both, of course I can't find the piece of paper, where you have this national performance framework which includes indicators that relate both to child rights and SDGs, right? And there's a very clear focus on outcomes that relate to child rights and SDGs. Okay, so again you see it. And then at Westminster we have a situation in which we don't have where there has been huge criticism of the fact that when we look at who is responsible for the implementation of the SDGs, not just abroad in our, you know, in development cooperation and assistance, but also domestically, it's a secretary. Effectively it's going to be the work of DFID, and it's the Secretary of State for International Development. Okay. So really, what does that say? Well, it really says that SDGs are for over there. They're certainly not for the UK. There's nothing to see here. So all I'm saying is that there is really interesting stuff internationally, and I give the UK and Ireland just because they're close neighbours, but also within the UK at the subnational and the national level. So that is potentially interesting as well, and there is better participatory child rights-based practice, I think, at a domestic policy level than there is at the international level. So, but then how do I deal with that if I'm interested in the most influential system? Finally, okay, so in conclusion, my view at the moment, and it may change, is at the moment we're not just at risk of ignoring children's rights. I think the SDGs risk undermining them in a profound way. And in a way, very importantly, that is likely to go beyond poverty and development to other sites of contestation, where states and others challenge the relevance, the added value and the enforceability of children's rights. Okay, because today we're talking about development, but there are obviously other areas where where a loss of children's rights in one area will have implications for other areas. And I do feel that unless its content and processes are effectively interrogated by child rights scholars, and I am a child rights scholar in this instance, sustainable development for children really risks becoming an alternative discourse or a framework embraced by states that in fact and in practice and in the past have proved themselves only too delighted to rid themselves of the burden of obligation and accountability when it comes to child rights and to human rights. So I leave it there, but I'd really welcome question and comments. Thank you.